Chapter 11 of Skylark Three by E. Smith. Chapter 11 Into a Sun. As Rovall and Seaton approached the physics laboratory at the beginning of the period of labor, another small airboat occupied by one man drew up beside them and followed them to the ground. The stranger, another white-bearded ancient, greeted Rovall cordially and was introduced to Seaton as Skylark, the First of Mechanism. "Truly, this is a high point in the course of Norlaminian science, my young friend." Skylark acknowledged the introduction smilingly. "You have enabled us to put into practice many things which our ancestors studied in theory for many a wearisome cycle of time." Turning to Rovall, he went on, "I understand that you require a particularly precise directional mechanism. I know well that it must indeed be one of exceeding precision and delicacy, for the controls you yourself have built are able to hold upon any point, however moving, within the limits of our immediate solar system." "We require controls 1,000,000 times as delicate as any I have constructed," said Rovall. "Therefore I have called your surpassing skill into cooperation. It is senseless for me to attempt a task in which I would be doomed to failure. We intend to send out a fifth-order projection, something none of our ancestors ever even dreamed of, which, with its inconceivable velocity of propagation, will enable us to explore any region in the galaxy as quickly as we now visit our closest sister planet. Knowing the dimensions of this, our galaxy, you can readily understand the exact degree of precision required to hold upon a point at its outermost edge." "Truly a problem worthy of any man's brain," Skylark replied after a moment's thought. "Those small circles," pointing to the 40-foot hour and declination circles, which Seaton had thought the ultimate in precise measurement of angular magnitudes, "are of course useless. I shall have to construct large and accurate circles, and in order to produce the slow and fast motions of the required nature, without creep, slip, play, or backlash, I shall require a pure torque, capable of being increased by infinitesimal increments. Pure torque." He thought deeply for a time, then went on. "No gear train or chain mechanism can be built of sufficient tightness, since in any mechanism there is some freedom of motion, however slight, and for this purpose the director must have no freedom of motion whatever. We must have a pure torque, and the only possible force answering our requirements is the 467th band of the fourth order. I shall therefore be compelled to develop that band. The director must, of course, have a full equatorial mounting, with circles some 250 feet in diameter. Must your projector tube be longer than that for correct design?" "That length will be ample." "The mountings must be capable of rotation through the full circle of arc in either plane, and must be driven in precisely the motion required to neutralize the motion of our planet, which, as you know, is somewhat irregular. Additional fast and slow motions must, of course, be provided to rotate the mechanism upon each graduated circle at the will of the operator. It is my idea to make the outer supporting tube very large, so that you will have full freedom with your inner or projector tube proper. It seems to me that dimensions X37, B42, J867 would perhaps be as good as any." "Perfectly satisfactory. You have the apparatus well in mind." "These things will consume some time. How soon will you require this mechanism?" asked Skylark. "We also have much to do. 2 periods of labor, let us say, or if you require them, 3. "It is well. 2 periods will be ample time. I was afraid that you might need it today, and the work cannot be accomplished in 1 period of labor. The mounting will of course be prepared in the area of experiment. Farewell." "You aren't going to build the final projector here, then?" Seaton asked as Skylark's flyer disappeared. We shall build it here, then transport it to the area where its dirigible housing will be ready to receive it. All mechanisms of that type are set up there. Not only is the location convenient to all interested, but there are to be found all necessary tools, equipment, and material. Also, and not least important for such long-range work as we contemplate, the entire area of experiment is anchored immovably to the solid crust of the planet, so that there can be not even the slightest vibration to affect the direction of our beams of force, which must, of course, be very long. He closed the master switches of his power plants, and the two resumed work where they had left off. The control panel was soon finished. Rovol then plated an immense cylinder of copper and placed it in the power plant. He next set up an entirely new system of refractory relief points and installed additional ground rods, sealed through the floor and extending deep into the ground below, explaining as he worked. You see, son, we must lose 1/1000% of our total energy, and provision must be made for its dissipation in order to avoid destruction of the laboratory. These air gap resistances are the simplest means of disposing of the wasted power. I get you, but say, how about disposing of it when we get the thing in a ship out in space? We picked up pretty heavy charges in the Skylark, so heavy that I had to hold up several times in the ionized layer of an atmosphere while they faded. And this outfit will burn up tons of copper where the old ones used ounces. In the projected space vessel we shall install converters to utilize all the energy, so that there will be no loss whatever. Since such converters must be designed and built especially for each installation, and since they require a high degree of precision, it is not worthwhile to construct them for a purely temporary mechanism such as this one. The walls of the laboratory were opened, ventilating blowers were built, and refrigerating coils were set up everywhere, even in the tubular structure and behind the visiplates. After assuring themselves that everything combustible had been removed, the two scientists put on under their helmets goggles whose protecting lenses could be built up to any desired thickness. Rovol then threw a switch, and a hemisphere of flaming golden radiance surrounded the laboratory and extended for miles upon all sides. "I get most of the stuff you've pulled so far, but why such a light?" asked Seaton. "As a warning. This entire area will be filled with dangerous frequencies, and that light is a warning for all uninsulated persons to give our theater of operations a wide berth." "I see. What next?" "All that remains to be done is to take our lens material and go," replied Rovol, as he took from a cupboard the largest phaedon that Seaton had ever seen. "Oh, that's what you're going to use. You know, I've been wondering about that stuff. I took one back with me to the Earth to experiment on. I gave it everything I could think of and couldn't touch it. I couldn't even make it change its temperature. What is it, anyway?" "It is not matter at all, in the ordinary sense of the word. It is almost pure crystallized energy. You have, of course, noticed that it looks transparent, but that it is not. You cannot see into its substance a millionth of a micron, the illusion of transparency being purely a surface phenomenon, and peculiar to this one form of substance. I have told you that the ether is a fourth-order substance. This also is a fourth-order substance, but it is crystalline, whereas the ether is probably fluid and amorphous. You might call this phaedon crystallized ether without being far wrong." "But it should weigh tons, and it is hardly heavier than air. Or no, wait a minute. Gravitation is also a fourth-order phenomenon, so it might not weigh anything at all, but it would have a terrific mass. Or would it, not having protons? Crystallized ether would displace fluid ether, so it might—" "I'll give up. It's too deep for me," said Seaton. "Its theory is abstruse, and I cannot explain it to you any more fully than I have, until after we have given you a knowledge of the fourth and fifth orders. Pure fourth-order material would be without weight and without mass. But these crystals, as they are found, are not absolutely pure. In crystallizing from the magma, they entrapped sufficient numbers of particles of the higher orders to give them the characteristics which you have observed. The impurities, however, are not sufficient in quantity to offer a point of attack to any ordinary reagent. But how could such material possibly be formed? It could be formed only in some such gigantic cosmic body as this, our green system, formed incalculable ages ago, when all the mass comprising it existed as one colossal sun. Picture for yourself the condition in the center of that sun. It has attained the theoretical maximum of temperature, some 70 million of your centigrade degrees. The electrons have been stripped from the protons until the entire central core is one solid ball of neutronium and can be compressed no more without destruction of the protons themselves. Since the pressure increases, the temperature, already at the theoretical maximum, can no longer increase. What happens? Disruption. Precisely. And just at the instant of disruption, during the very instant of generation of the frightful forces that are to hurl suns, planets, and satellites millions of miles out into space, in that instant of time, as a result of those unimaginable temperatures and pressures, the phaedon comes into being. It can be formed only by the absolute maximum of temperature and at a pressure which can exist only momentarily, even in the largest conceivable masses. Then how can you make a lens of it? It must be impossible to work it in any way. It cannot be worked in any ordinary way, but we shall take this crystal into the depths of that white dwarf star, into a region in which obtain pressures and temperatures only less than those giving it birth. There we shall play forces upon it which, under those conditions, will be able to work it quite readily. I want to see that. Let's go. They seated themselves at the panels, and Rovol began to manipulate keys, levers, and dials. Instantly, a complex structure of visible force, rods, beams, and flat areas of flaming scarlet energy, appeared at the end of the tubular telescope-like network. Why red? Merely to render them visible. One cannot work well with invisible tools, hence I have imposed a color-light frequency upon the invisible frequencies of the forces. We will have an assortment of colors if you prefer. And as he spoke, each ray assumed a different color, so that the end of the projector was almost lost beneath a riot of color. The structure of force, which Seaton knew was the secondary projector, swung around as if sentient, and a lurid green ray extended itself, picked up the phaedon, and lengthened out, hurling the jewel 1,000 yards out through the open side of the laboratory. Rovol moved more controls, and the structure again righted itself, swinging back into perfect alignment with the tube, and carrying the phaedon upon its extremity 1,000 yards beyond the roof of the laboratory. We are now ready to start our projection. Be sure your suit and goggles are perfectly tight. We must see what we are doing, so the light rays must be heterodyned upon our carrier wave. Therefore the laboratory and all its neighborhood will be flooded with dangerous frequencies from the sun we are to visit, as well as those from our own generators. Okay, Chief, all tight here. You say it's 10 light years to that star? How long's it going to take us to get there? About 10 minutes. We could travel that far in less than 10 seconds, but for the fact that we must take the phaedon with us. Slight as is its mass, it will require much energy in its acceleration. Our projections, of course, have no mass, and will require only the energy of propagation. Rovol flicked a finger. A massive pair of plunger switches shot into their sockets, and Seaton, seated at his board and staring into his visiplate, was astounded to find that he apparently possessed a dual personality. He knew that he was seated motionless in the operator's chair at the base of the rigidly anchored primary projector, and by taking his eyes away from the visiplate before him, He could see that nothing in the laboratory had changed, except that the pyrotechnic display from the power bar was of unusual intensity. Yet, looking into the visiplate, he was out in space in person, hurtling through space at a pace beside which the best effort of the Skylark seemed the veriest crawl. Swinging his controls to look backward, he gasped as he saw, so stupendous was their velocity, that the green system was only barely discernible as a faint green star. Again, looking forward, it seemed as though a fierce white star had separated from the immovable firmament and was now so close to the structure of force in which he was riding that it was already showing a disk perceptible to the unaided eye. A few minutes more, and the violet white splendor became so intense that the watchers began to build up, layer by layer, the protective goggles before their eyes. As they approached still closer, falling with their unthinkable velocity into that incandescent inferno, a sight was revealed to their eyes such as man has never before been privileged to gaze upon. They were falling into a white dwarf star, could see everything visible during such an unheard-of journey, and would live to remember what they had seen. They saw the magnificent spectacle of solar prominences shooting hundreds of thousands of miles into space, and directly in their path they saw an immense sunspot, a combined volcanic eruption and cyclonic storm, in a gaseous liquid medium of blinding incandescence. "Better dodge that spot, hadn't we, Ace? Mightn't it be generating interfering fourth-order frequencies?" cried Seaton. "It is undoubtedly generating fourth-order rays, but nothing can interfere with us since we are controlling every component of our beam from Norlamin." Seaton gripped his handrail violently and involuntarily drew himself together into the smallest possible compass as, with their awful speed unchecked, they plunged through that flaming incandescent photosphere and on, straight down into the unexplored, unimaginable interior of that frightful and searing orb. Through the protecting goggles, now a full 4 inches of that peculiar golden shielding metal, Seaton could see the structure of force in which he was, and could also see the Phaedon in outline as transparent diamonds are visible in equally transparent water. Their apparent motion slowed rapidly, and the material about them thickened and became more and more opaque. The Phaedon drew back toward them until it was actually touching the projector, and eddy currents and striae became visible in the mass about them as their progress grew slower and slower. "'Smatter, something gone screwy?" demanded Seaton. "Not at all. Everything is working perfectly. The substance is now so dense that it is becoming opaque to rays of the fourth order, so that we are now partially displacing the medium instead of moving through it without friction. At the point where we can barely see to work, that is, when the fourth-order rays will be so retarded that they can no longer carry the heterodyne light waves without complete distortion, we shall stop automatically, as the material at that depth will have the required density to refract the fifth-order rays to the correct degree." "How can our foundation stand it?" asked Seaton. "This stuff must be 100 times as dense as platinum already, and we must be pushing a horrible load in going through it." "We are exerting no force whatever upon our foundations, nor upon Norlamin. The force is transmitted without loss from the power plant in our laboratory to this secondary projector here inside the star, where it is liberated in the correct band to pull us through the mass, using all the mass ahead of us as anchorage. When we wish to return, we shall simply change the pull into a push. Ah, we are now at a standstill. Now comes the most important moment of the entire project." All apparent motion had ceased, and Seaton could see only dimly the outlines of the Phaedon now directly before his eyes. The structure of force slowly warped around until its front portion held the Phaedon as in a vise. Rovol pressed a lever, and behind them, in the laboratory, 4 enormous plunger switches drove home. A plane of pure energy, flaming radiantly even in the indescribable incandescence of the core of that seething star, bisected the Phaedon neatly, and 10 gigantic beams, 5 upon each half of the jewel, rapidly molded 2 sections of a geometrically perfect hollow lens. The 2 sections were then brought together by the closing of the jaws of the mighty vise, their edges in exact alignment. Instantly, the plane and the beams of energy became transformed into 2 terrific opposing tubes of force, vibrant, glowing tubes, whose edges in contact coincided with the almost invisible seam between the 2 halves of the lens. Like a welding arc raised to the nth power, these 2 immeasurable and irresistible forces met exactly in opposition. A meeting of such incredible violence that seismic disturbances occurred throughout the entire mass of that dense violet white star. Sunspots of unprecedented size appeared, prominences erupted to hundreds of times their normal distance, and, although the 2 scientists deep in the core of the tormented star were unaware of what was happening upon its surface, convolution after titanic convolution racked the mighty globe, and enormous masses of molten and gaseous material were riven from it and hurled far out into space, masses which would in time become planets of that youthful and turbulent luminary. Seaton felt his air supply grow hot. Suddenly it became icy cold, and knowing that Rovol had energized the refrigeration system, Seaton turned away from the fascinating welding operation for a quick look around the laboratory. As he did so, he realized Rovol's vast knowledge and understood the reason for the new system of relief points and ground rods, as well as the necessity for the all-embracing scheme of refrigeration. Even through the practically opaque goggles, he could see that the laboratory was one mass of genuine lightning. Not only from the relief points, but from every metallic corner and protuberance the pent-up losses from the disintegrating bar were hurling themselves upon the flaring blue-white, rapidly volatilizing ground rods, and the very air of the room, renewed second by second though it was by the powerful blowers, was beginning to take on the pearly luster of the highly ionized corona. The bar was plainly visible, a scintillating demon of pure violet radiance, and a momentary spasm of fear seized him as he saw how rapidly that great mass of copper was shrinking, fear that their power would be exhausted with their task still uncompleted. But the calculations of the aged physicist had been accurate. The lens was complete with some hundreds of pounds of copper to spare, and that geometrical form, with its precious content of semi-neutronium, was following the secondary projector back toward the green system. Rovol left his seat, discarded his armor, and signaled Seaton to do the same. "I've got to hand it to you, Ace. You sure are a blinding flash and a deafening report," Seaton exclaimed, writhing out of his insulating suit. "I feel as though I've been pulled halfway through a knothole and riveted over on both ends. How big a lens did you make, anyway? Looked as though it would hold a couple of liters, maybe 3. Its contents are almost exactly 3 liters. 7.5 million kilograms, say 8,000 tons. Some mass, I'd say, to put into a gallon jug. Of course, being inside the Phaedon, it won't have any weight, but it'll have all its full quota of inertia. That's why you're taking so long to bring it in, of course." "Yes. The projector will now bring it here into the laboratory without any further attention from us. The period of labor is about to end, and tomorrow we shall find the lens awaiting us when we arrive to begin work." "How about cooling it off? It had a temperature of something like 40 million degrees centigrade before you started working on it, and when you got done with it, it was hot." "You're forgetting again, son. Remember that the hot, dense material is entirely enclosed in an envelope impervious to all vibrations longer than those of the 5th order. You could put your hand upon it now without receiving any sensation either of heat or of cold." "Yeah, that's right, too. I noticed that I could take a phaeton right out of an electric arc and it wouldn't even be warm. I couldn't explain why it was, but I see now. So that stuff inside that lens will always stay as hot as it is right now? Zowie! Here's hoping she never explodes. Well, there's the bell. For once in my life I'm all ready to quit when the whistle blows." And arm in arm the young terrestrial chemist and the aged Norlaminian physicist strolled out to their waiting airboat. End of chapter 11.